Hi, everybody. Welcome to Colorado Inside Out. I'm your host, Patricia Calhoun, sitting in for Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you for joining us. Let's get a quick take on the resignation of Veterans Administration Secretary Eric Shinseki. Senator Mark Udall led the charge as the first Democratic senator to call for his resignation this week. Eric Sonderman from SE2, will Shinseki's resignation affect policy reform?
Well, we can only hope so, because policy certainly needs to be reformed around the VA. I mean, what went on was appalling. Kudos to CNN and others for finally bringing it to light. Mark Udall was the first Democrat. I don't know if we can give him all the credit for leading this charge, because there's been plenty of commentary for plenty of weeks, but he was the first Democrat to break ranks earlier this week and call for Shinseki's resignation, and he probably gets some points for doing that. I don't know if he saw the light on that one or felt the political heat being in this very tough contested Senate race here, but there is plenty of room for reform there, and the real issue is, should it be the same model it has historically been with a captive audience, or should it look much more like Medicare, where yes, the taxpayers pay for it, it is a federal program, but it is not a captive program?
Well, it's a mess. David Kopel from the Independence Institute and DU Law, how do you see this shaking out?
Well, I think Mark Udall was decisive. He was the first. There had been some Democratic Senate candidates who had called for Shinseki's resignation. Udall was the first incumbent Democratic senator to do so. And notably, once Udall had crossed that line, Representative Michaud, from Maine, I believe, the ranking Democrat on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, also called for Shinseki's resignation last night. And I think that was they knew it was going to be a cascade. The conventional wisdom had been that Obama would keep Shinseki around long enough to draw some fire for at least a while, and now that's been done. I think Eric is right that changing Shinseki doesn't change the system. It's been dysfunctional for a long time before Eric Shinseki became the head of the VA. Candidate Obama accurately criticized the problems it had under Bush, and they go way before Bush. And part of the problem, as Eric said, is this forced captive audience. If you're a veteran and you say have arthritis, you may be, because you're like 72 years old, you may be forced to go to the VA hospital, supposedly because that's a service-related injury. And if you're in something that the VA says, we have jurisdiction over you, you have to go to the VA, and you don't have the option of using your Medicare benefits to choose your own doctor. So liberating our veterans and giving them more choice for where they seek medical care is one of the things that will reduce the pressure on the system and the waiting times.
Penn Tate, lawyer with Traurig, and a name I forget because I've been so busy pronouncing Traurig right, and former legislator. Where do you think it's going to go from here with the VA's office?
You know, first it's Greenberg Traurig, and I guess it's going to go a couple places. I think based on what Eric and David said, I agree. Policy change is inevitable. I am convinced that the reason Shinseki's gone is because the administration knows this probably is far worse than has been disclosed to this point. Udall deserves credit for being one of the first Dems to step out there and call for a resignation. But David's also right. This is not a new problem. This has existed for a long time. And I think the more interesting policy issue that we'll see develop is Congress's oversight responsibility and how it's exercised. Because CNN was on the fleeting edge of breaking the story, but some other things they've reported have been that in prior reports by the Inspector General's office, there were references in prior years to this same issue, waiting list problems and vets not being seen, not being on the list, and just a whole management issue. So there were some members of the Veterans Affairs committees and others that knew this was a problem. So, you know, what's different is that it's now been exposed to the full light of day and everyone's scrambling. But Shinseki and the president weren't the only two that knew that this was a problem. It's been a hot mess for a long time, and it deserves exposure because our veterans deserve better than what they're getting.
And batting cleanup, Natasha Gardener, senior editor at 5280. Where do you see this going now?
Well, if there's one issue that we should be able to get behind in a bipartisan effort, it should be this, is healthcare for our veterans. So I'm hoping that we're going to see some change out of Washington and addressing this issue and going forward with it. You know, it's interesting that Udall came out when he did, so come history, when we're counting the rolls, he came out on the right side of the fence, but his opponent, Gardner, also did that and actually did that before he did. So we're going to also hear this discussed during the re-election campaign, because that the question of timing of why did you do this, was it for political issue reasons, will become part of that. And then finally, I think it's important to note that there are some key reporters across the country, specifically in San Francisco, in Arizona, and actually some local ones too, who have been following the VA, battering them down, working with their PIOs to really try to get information about what was happening. And it's thanks to those efforts, I think, that some of this is really catching on a mainstream media level, but also for the rest of the country. It's high time that we address this issue.
And we're going to be addressing not just this specific issue, but the fact that the VA new hospital coming out east of here is also incredibly over budget. That's going to be a huge issue in coming months. But right now, Vice President Joe Biden was in Colorado this week to speak at the Air Force Academy graduation and stump for Senator Mark Udall. He took the opportunity to make a pitch for immigration reform while at a coffee house in Northwest Denver. Eric, how effective do you think these campaign stops are going to be for Udall?
Well, first of all, kudos to the Vice President for speaking out on immigration reform. We'll see if President Obama has any juice left, given the political environment, given that he is now starting to enter the last 2.5 years of his presidency. But if there's any juice left, immigration reform would be a great issue on which to use it and try to form some kind of bipartisan coalition. In terms of the politics of it with Mark Udall, I don't think it's terribly effective. I think it's almost a way for Udall to get off the dime, because he keeps being badgered with questions about, are you going to have the president campaign for you? And when that question was posed to him by Dana Bash, I think it was right after the State of the Union speech in January, Udall was not particularly on his game that night and gave sort of a rambling, incoherent, non-committal answer. So this is a way of saying, I have the vice president here, I'm deeply connected to the Obama administration, without perhaps actually having the president himself come to town. I have a hard time believing there is any voter in Colorado who really cares about what Vice President Joe Biden says, who is not already in the Mark Udall column in terms of where that vote is going. So does it turn any votes? Color me very skeptical.
David, do you care what Vice President Joe Biden says?
No, nor does really President Obama. But it's similar to Bush Cheney in the late part of their administration, where the opposite party says, please, please come and campaign in our state, because now the majority of the public has found you so annoying that it'll help the opposite side. But what they can do is raise money, and that's an important thing. And Biden, in fact, went on to a big fundraiser in California at the home of billionaire Tom Steyer as part of his Western swing. On immigration, the deal is there and everybody knows it if the White House wanted to make it, which is step one, actually stop the flow of illegal immigrants coming into the country. Step two, then have some process of legalization for the people who are here. But the Bush White House, like the Obama White House, resolutely opposes step one, and they're always saying, no, we're going to do step two first, and then we promise that there will be at some point, someday, where we stop the flow of illegal aliens, and everybody knows that's not true, and they have no credibility on this issue. If they would have done that back when they had the opportunity in the Bush administration and actually stopped the flow, we'd already be at step two, and that would have been completed years ago.
Pentate of Greenberg-Traurig, where do you see this going?
First of all, I think it was a helpful stop for Udall. And while Eric's right that there's a question whether the president has any juice, what does have juice is this issue of immigration reform. And you saw it play out because Cory Garner's come out with these commercials where someone is speaking Spanish in the background, but it's not Cory. I saw Mark Udall at an event last week, the Flor y Canto event, and he did a brief greeting in Spanish to the crowd. So that played well. But this is an issue, and I disagree with David. The deal's not there, which is why it hasn't been done up to this point, because you have too many people who are saying, no, this whole seal the border piece needs to be addressed. But we've got a bunch of people here now, which is why we've had the access bill in Colorado for undocumented students who graduate from our high schools and then want to go to college. And a number of communities and states in this country are dealing with the influx of undocumented immigrants. And I think people are rightfully saying, let's manage the situation internally first. We still need to look at some sort of border control or border management, but that's not going to come first, because the problem is in our streets, in our communities, and in our businesses. And so I think Udall's right to have the Vice President come out, touch on this issue in Northwest Denver, because regardless of whether it's Joe Biden or President Obama, the issue still resonates with a large number of Colorado voters.
Natasha, how do you think this Biden stop played for Udall?
Well, I think that at this point in the campaign, it's really important for both of these candidates to sit down and say, where are our policy pages? Like, where do we stand on issues? And it makes perfect sense for Udall to come in on the immigration reform angle. So Biden was a nice way of presenting that to a community that is not new to this conversation. I mean, how many elections happen in Colorado where immigration hasn't been a major topic? And this just says that it will be again. So it'll be interesting to see how Udall takes the next step to build upon what Biden was introducing to a larger audience in Colorado, and we'll start to see that in the coming weeks.
And we could be talking a lot more about immigration if Tom Tancredo winds up getting the Republican nomination. But right now we're talking about a U.S. Supreme Court decision will mean that Fox News reporter Jana Winter will not be forced to reveal her source for obtaining the notebook that was reportedly sent by James Holmes to his therapist. Meanwhile, defense attorneys requested that the jury selection be closed in order to ask potential jurors about opinions on the insanity defense. David, what do you make of the impact of this week's developments?
Well, good news for the press, obviously, and what the Supreme Court decided was simply they weren't going to review the decision below where Fox News had won that case. In terms of closing the courtroom, you can understand the arguments on that, but as the judge said, the presumption in our country is that trials are going to be open, and that's an important part of our Constitution. And it's even when you have both the plaintiff and the defendant in a case agree that they'd like the courtroom closed for something, judges will sometimes and often say no. I'm not here as your personal mediator that you hired through the American Arbitration Association. I'm performing a public function. The court belongs to the people, and it should be open so that the people can see what's going on. And so it's a very high bar to ask a judge to close the courtroom.
As the other lawyer at the table, Penn, what do you think of this week's action?
I think the Supreme Court's decision was predictable. It's consistent with a line of cases where they've shielded reporters from having to disclose sources. And similarly, I think the judge's decision was predictable also. There's a presumption of innocence, and there's a presumption that these public tribunals are open public tribunals. That's been our nation's history. I think there are a couple of other interesting things. We often are critical of the jury system, and I think we don't always give jurors credit for being able to sit through a trial, listen to instructions from the judge, and follow instructions and base a decision on the evidence presented in the courtroom, regardless of everything that's going on out in the community. So that's the first thing. The reason you do the selection process is we all have preconceived notions, we all have biases. It's to flesh those out and see if they will impact the ability of the jury to be fair and impartial. And third, and I don't know if it's going to play out in this trial or not, is I would imagine Holmes' defense team is going to start pressing the issue of how did this notebook get released and were his rights somehow violated through this process. That's going to be a fascinating evidentiary argument at some point.
And Natasha, as the journalist at the table, what do you think about the Jana Winters? Well, the fact that they're not taking on that case.
Well, it's good news for reporters. It certainly gives a sigh of relief to various people, particularly people who were concerned about the New York statute here, which is what came into play with this particular reporter. I think as a reporter locally watching this case, one of the things I'm really interested to see where it goes is this question of whether they can ask jurors about the insanity plea and their opinions on that. I think, unfortunately, mental health is usually connected with conversations related to mass killings in an inappropriate way often. But I do think that people make that leap. They make those connections. And so it seems appropriate to have that conversation with potential jurors. But whether or not that's allowed, it's going to be a fascinating jury selection no matter what. But if that is part of it, it will become a fascinating investigation.
And Eric, as we head to this October trial, where do you see this going?
Well, in this case, I think, to use Natasha's phrase, it's good news for reporters. I think what's good news for reporters is good news for the country as a whole. I think the SHIELD law is important. I think you get higher quality journalism. And so I'm glad Jana Waters is off this hook. It shouldn't have taken this long to get her off this hook. In terms of the trial, you know, our system has gone so far from the concept of swift justice. And I personally, I'm not one of the lawyers at this table, and I know there are reasons for how long everything drags out, but whether it is the trial, getting to the trial date, the length of the trial itself, and then the length of, you know, an appellate process, particularly in a capital case, which can take 20 years, I'm all in favor of defendants having their presumption of innocence and having all their rights, but there has to be a way to have a swifter, surer system than what we have. The plea bargain was there for District Attorney Brockler to take. And if the death penalty has any real efficacy these days, it's as leverage in order to get a plea to a case like this, to hold it over a defendant. The plea bargain was there to make this trial disappear, to put this guy away for the rest of his natural life and then some. But the district attorney did not want the plea bargain in this case. I'm not sure that was the right call.
But it does give us things to talk about for months to come. Meanwhile, the El Paso County Commissioners voted to ask El Paso County Sheriff Terry Maketa to resign after controversy surrounding the sheriff increased this week. Complaints have been filed alleging a hostile work environment, and personal emails were released this week exposing alleged affairs with sheriff's office employees. Maketa is term limited, but will the pressure to resign increase? Penn, what do you think?
Absolutely, it will increase. And I think the problem that the sheriff has is, as the principal law enforcement agency in the county, he's accused of breaking laws in a rather significant fashion. It's all alleged right now. I'm a bit taken aback because what I've seen in the press appears to be him saying, I'm not resigning, not that this is a witch hunt, people are after me, it's all made up. It's just, I'm not resigning. I think for the sake of the office at this point, and given that he is term limited, he can't run again, and he's likely unemployable until this matter is resolved anyway, he ought to just step down and let the county begin to heal and move forward.
Natasha, more good reporting by Pulitzer winner Dave Phillips. Where do you see this going now?
Well, it could turn into the Anthony Weiner of Colorado at this rate. Frankly, I don't care what he does in his personal life. That's just not something that is important to me. However, I do care when it affects his job, when it affects the employees he supervises, when it affects the budget that he oversees. And that's what the allegations relate to, is that work performance. And of course, those allegations should be investigated. So I don't think this is the last we're going to hear of this. And frankly, probably not the last time we talk about it at this table.
No, probably not. Eric, as a political strategist, what would you do if you were Terry Maketa?
Well, thank God I'm not Terry Maketa. I'm not sure he's listening to political strategists of any kind these days. He's on an island rather by himself here. Of course he ought to resign. That would be the classy thing to do, but I'm not sure the word class is necessarily in his vocabulary. We certainly haven't seen that. Right now, the county commissioners, yes, they can unanimously ask for his resignation, but they don't have a lot of leverage. They can't demand it. The only thing the way to legally get rid of him is by recall, but by the time he went through the recall process, his term is over anyway. Penn is right. He's largely unemployable. And given that situation, he might try to ride this gravy train out until next January when he leaves office. The only leverage might be some of the legal investigations going on. If there could be some kind of leverage exerted there to get him out of office, the sooner the better.
And we're going to skip David on this one because he represents Sheriff Maketa in a completely unrelated gun case. All right, moving on to number 4. The Jefferson County School Board voted 3-2 to approve the hiring of Daniel McMenemy as its new superintendent this week. The board is coming under fire for limiting public comment and the $280,000 annual salary offered in the 5-year contract. Natasha, what do you think of the annual salary and how this contract was awarded?
Well, surprise, surprise, Jefferson County has a lot of drama around the school board issues. I mean, it's almost like a 1980s TV miniseries sometimes when they have their meetings. I think it's interesting. People should look into his past. He's coming from Douglas County. He has a really impressive history at Rock Canyon, but he also has some pretty controversial involvements with the teacher union. There's certainly people who think he did a great job in those negotiations and people who don't think that way. As a closing comment, I can't pass up the opportunity to point out how little we pay teachers. So his salary is going to be based at $280,000. In Jefferson County, the starting salary for a teacher is around $33,000. I'm not saying that he wouldn't deserve that salary. I just want to point out that that's a pretty small salary.
Pretty big gap. Eric, what do you think about how Jeffco handed down this contract and what kind of job he'll do?
Well, I mean, David had a conflict on the last one. On this one, our firm, I'm not directly involved, but our firm is doing some work with the Jefferson County School District, so I'll put that on the table. I don't know if the contract that was proposed is going to be the final contract or not. Obviously, Natasha's point is not without foundation, and those comparisons will be made. Ultimately, Dan McNinemy is going to be judged by the results. Is he able to close achievement gaps? Is he able to raise achievement performance among kids? I am personally hopeful that Jeffco will, I'm hopeful about two things. Number one, that at some point some measure of civility takes hold. Yes, I know passions are high on both sides of this political divide around the recent school board elections out there. But the behavior we're seeing out of some people you would never countenance in a classroom, you would never countenance out of your kids. And at some point the adults need to learn to behave themselves as well as we expect kids to behave themselves. Secondly, I hope the Denver model, to some degree, the model for Jeffco should not be Douglas County. The model for Jeffco should be Denver. For every high-performing school out there, there are a whole lot of schools with very low-performing numbers. And to the extent we can bring some charters, whether it's Denver School of Science and Technology or Strive or new players to help boost performance out there, the sooner the better. David,
what do you think is going on in Jeffco?
Well, it's interesting how this mob that has worked itself into a rage over the Jeffco, over the process by which the new superintendent was hired, seemed to have forgotten how the previous superintendent was hired. The board has made a lot of progress, actually, on transparency. When Cindy Stevenson was hired, the board was in an executive session, and nobody knew what was really going on. It said like personnel issues or something. Then they come out of executive session and immediately, with no notice to the public, vote in public to give her the contract. The current board, with the advance notice they provided and the opportunity for public input, has certainly made a significant progress from that bad example. It would have been even better. They had 45 minutes of public comment. It would have been better if they'd had longer public comment. But they're certainly improving their scores on transparency compared to their predecessors. In terms of how this guy's going to do, he was in charge of secondary education in Douglas County. The TCAP scores went up, and the on-time graduation rate also went up significantly. Douglas isn't Jefferson. It's not Denver either. It's a extremely diverse district, and it'll be a big challenge for him. But based on his record of success in an adjoining district, he has a good chance.
Penn, any quick thoughts on Jeffco?
Sure. I find it ironic that this new reform majority is behaving like the old majority that they were extremely critical of. And David's point about enhanced transparency, I think, misses the mark. I mean, if you grade the activities of the prior board for transparency as an F, you can't celebrate being at a D level now because you know where you need to go. And so the reality is this fellow may be eminently qualified, but sometimes process, how you do things, may be more important than what you do. And you're now starting off this superintendent with a pretty significant salary given what teachers in Jeffco make, and with a process that, for better or for worse, is going to have a cloud over him for a period of time. You know, I wish him all the best. I hope he does well, because we all need our kids to succeed and graduate from high school in higher numbers.
All right, now time for our favorite favorite portion of the show. Let's bring some class to that seat. Eric, what's your disgrace?
Wow, that's a high bar to set. I was going to go with the Miller moths, who have invaded all of our homes these days. But speaking of annoying pests that won't go away, how about Joe Nacho, who graced us again just when we didn't need him with an interview with our friends at CBS 4. Still clueless, still remorseless, although now he does have the shaved head and the goatee. But speaking of things that come back that we don't need, I would say that.
Very classy. David, your disgrace.
The White House, which accidentally outed the identity of the CIA stations chief in Afghanistan. You can call the White House a lot of things, but competent in foreign policy is not one of them.
Penn, your disgrace.
Sheriff Maketa, he just needs to go ahead and pack up and go away.
And Natasha.
I'll round back on the VA thing. I don't think enough people have said it clearly enough, but service members, I'm sorry. We can do better.
And now let's go on to something nice. Eric.
Sure, Peyton Manning, and not for his performance on the football field, although that is impressive enough, but through his foundation, the Payback Foundation, recently awarded over $1 million in grants to over 150 youth-serving organizations, 80 some of them here in Colorado, including the Colorado I Have a Dream Foundation, where I'm the board chair, fortunately, this year. He truly gives back to the community.
That's great. David.
The teachers all over the state at both the public schools and the independent schools who are finishing another year of hard work and helping kids.
Penn.
To our many wonderful cultural facilities in our region, with spring getting ready to turn into summer, and I think the first free day at the Denver Zoo, which packed my neighborhood in Park Hill, we're going to have a wonderful summer to look forward to some exciting venues and programs.
That's great. And Natasha?
I have to say the rescue efforts and just the community efforts around the Mesa County mudslide, that the community is hurting. They've been really classy throughout it, and we wish them the best.
And I want to say something nice about Sonny Lawson Field and the park, which is getting rededicated today, and the homeless baseball games that are starting again on Tuesday mornings. It's a great thing to go experience at Sonny Lawson Field. Anyway, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thanks for tuning in. For our viewers watching the live stream right now, stay tuned for a special behind the scenes segment. And for our broadcast viewers, we'll see you next week. For everyone here at Channel 12, I'm Patricia Calhoun. Thanks for watching and good night.